Okay, it's time to conclude here with part 3 of democratically electing the president. And in the first 2 videos, we talked extensively about equality of participation in the process. Who gets to participate? Well, the states do, because the union is of the states. The union is not of the people. Why is the union of the states? Well, because the states, each state declared their independence from the state of Great Britain to make the decisions of a free and independent state, to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do, which is an action, all other acts and things that a free and independent state may by right do. Okay? And those independent states, after they declared their independence, formed a union. And they had to come up with a participation versus compliance agreement that established the benefits, privileges, rights of participation in decision making, and cost of membership in the union. And that rights of participation in decision making is in a legislative assembly. And each state is apportioned representation and suffrage to participate in that legislative assembly. And that legislative assembly can be assembled as a democracy, where all the states have equal suffrage to reach a majority consensus, and they have equality of participation in determining questions and in determining the scope and cost and the cost-benefit relationships and everything like that. So they can participate as equals in that process. Okay? That's a democracy. That's a legislative assembly that's governed by a legislative process. Part of that process is identification and deliberating questions, which is done by a quorum. Quorum has to participate in order to do that. Then once they have reached a decision as the quorum, then that decision is put to the states to determine the question by vote. 1 vote per state, and a majority of the states is necessary to the choice. So that is a democracy. So the same dynamic of democracy is in the selection of the president. Just like they didn't want the seat of government to be within a state. You can't choose the president by a competitive process either. A state cannot dominate, no state can dominate the process to choose the president. Even though the president really doesn't have any duties other than to preside over the executive departments. That means they don't participate in the executive departments directly. In fact, right there in the Constitution, it tells you in Article 2 that the limits of the president's involvement in the executive departments is to require in writing the opinion of the department heads of the subjects and duties that they are working on. And an opinion is not the details of those subjects and duties. Who does get the details? Well, Congress does. The states assembled in the Senate. And the Senate has a special, I won't get into the Senate today, but the Senate is special for its number and the actions that they take in the Senate together as the Union. Okay, that's how they act. And it's all about secrecy and dispatch, continuity and stability of government. All that goes into what makes the Senate the Senate. Okay, and the states must participate as equals in the Senate because that's a democracy. It's not. It's the least numerous branch for a reason. Okay. So when we start talking about how do you democratically elect the president, well, all the states must participate as equals in choosing the president, and all the states have a entitlement. They're all entitled to have some of their own citizens considered for the position. Okay? And that's where you get into this democratic process to elect the president, where each state has a number of persons that they can have considered from their own state. Okay? That must be considered by all the states in Congress. Well, how many is that? Well, if it's a strict democracy, then it has to be a fixed number, like 3 or 5 from their own state. Being a republic or Republican form of government, each state can be apportioned a number of choices equal to their proportion in Congress, in the most numerous legislative branch, because that's where the people are represented. That's a representation of the people. A representative is somebody you hire to advocate for your interest. A representation is a smaller version of the original. So the most numerous legislative branch has to be an exact representation of the full demographic diversity of the population that assembles that branch of the legislature, of the state legislature, because that's where the requirement comes in order to qualify the electorate to assemble that most numerous legislative branch. The qualification of the electorate isn't just 18 years old and a citizen of that state. No, that electorate must produce that most numerous legislative branch, which is an exact representation of the population of the state. Okay? So that's how many choices they get. Then all those choices must be transmitted to Congress, transmitted to the seat of government, directed to the president of the Senate. Then when it gets there, there are requirements for quorum and for majority consensus. The requirement for a quorum for the electors is 2/3 of the states must participate and send a list of candidates to Congress to be considered. That's the first quorum. The majority consensus on the votes of the electors is a majority of all the people, because the electors are an exact representation of all the people because they equal an exact representation of the most numerous legislative branch, which is a representation of all the people. So the first requirement for winning is have a majority of all the people. All. Okay? And if no one gets that majority by having a majority of the electors, being identified by a majority of the electors on one of their two ballots, then the states must consider the top 5 based on Article 2, Section 1. So they would deliberate the qualifications and suitability of those top 5 people on that aggregate list in Congress and determine their choice by vote. Each state would vote 1 vote per state, and a majority of all the states is necessary to the choice. Of those 5 people, that's a ballot that the states must use in order to make the choice. They don't have any choice in it. That's why it's disconnected. You have 2 parts. The electors make the list. The states make the choice. Okay? The quorum requirement for that is 2/3 of the states must participate in Congress to vote, deliberate, consider and vote to determine the choice. And the majority is of all the states, no matter how many actually participate. So 2/3 of the states today is 33, 66 is 67 percent, which is 36 states, I think, 34 states must participate in that process to deliberate and choose the president by vote. And that majority consensus must be 26 states must vote for one person to be the president. Okay? And then by Article 2, Section 1, the person who came in second would be the vice president. By the 12th Amendment, only the top 3 are on the aggregate list for president are considered, and the top 2 on the aggregate list for vice president are considered. You notice they still got 5. We'll get into that later when we talk about amendments. And the same holds. They consider those persons and to determine their vote, determine their choice by vote, 1 vote per state, the majority of the states necessary to the choice. Okay, that's democratically electing the president. You can't form and meet the requirements for quorum and majority consensus at the ballot box. How did they make that daggone ballot at the ballot box? You have to have a quorum of all the people just to make the ballot. Just to make the ballot. You can't come up with some election law to decide how you get on the ballot, candidates who want to be on the ballot and parties who want their candidates on the ballot. No. A quorum of all the people must determine the ballot in every state. And then the choices that are made by the electors must be reported in a list that they certify that every person on the list meets the requirements for holding office and that each elector made at least one choice from a state other than their own. And that's where I'm going to leave it today. Thanks.